Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers, and today we have an update on the H5N1 bird flu outbreak. Stephanie Desmond talks to Hopkins virologist Andy Pekosz and Hopkins veterinarian Meghan Davis about recent developments, including the U.S.'s first death of a human, and why it's time to double down on measures to respond to this virus. Let's listen.
Meghan Davis and Andy Pekosz, thanks so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
Always happy to be here.
So the last time the three of us talked on the podcast was in November. And we talked, of course, today's topic is bird flu. And so I wanted to give an update on where things stand today. I do know that we recently had a death from the bird flu.
There was an infection in a person in Louisiana. He apparently acquired the infection because they had a backyard flock of chickens that had become exposed to wild birds. Both the chickens the person was raising as well as the wild birds were found dead. The person got exposed by it, was hospitalized, and ended up dying from the infection. If that wasn't serious enough, when the CDC scientists sequenced samples from this individual, they found that the virus had started to mutate at two particular sites that we know are important for adapting H5N1 to better replicate in humans. This very much mirrors a case that happened about 2 months ago in British Columbia, where a hospitalized person infected with H5N1, the virus infecting them started to change to adapt to infect humans better. So again, we're seeing all these signs that this virus is really moving into humans. It's got the capability to adapt to humans. And just another reminder, we really got to double down our efforts to make sure we limit at one level the H5N1 infections in humans to try to lower the opportunity for this virus to really learn how to infect humans effectively.
So we are smack dab in the middle of flu season. And Andy, I wanted to ask you about that. That brings a set of challenges that we didn't see 2 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to start with the positive. So the positive side of this is that lots of hospitals and areas are now testing extensively for influenza. So that increases our monitoring because there are systems where we can, if we find influenza positive cases, we can move them through and figure out if they're seasonal flu or an H5N1. So in some ways, our testing is becoming a little bit more robust. But it raises the concern that a person who is infected with both seasonal influenza and an H5N1 may be able to have those viruses recombine or reassort is how we influenza people say it, exchange genetic material with themselves and make a virus that's better able to infect humans and has this H5 gene, which we're so worried about. That's called reassortment, like I said. And we know that reassortment has resulted in the influenza viruses that have caused the last 3 human pandemics. So it's a very rare event, but again, we know that that's what the virus can do to cause a pandemic. So we're now extra vigilant about monitoring for seasonal influenza and these potential co-infections.
Meghan, what are your concerns right now? I mean, are we at a really dangerous point here?
We are if you're a house cat. I think that the biggest challenge I've been seeing is that whatever we identify or not in people who are maybe consuming raw milk or eating raw meat or undercooked meat products, that when this happens in cats, that it causes extremely severe disease and very high mortality rates. So we've now had a number of recalls, not just of raw milk that was contaminated with H5N1, but also raw meat, pet food products, that is, products that are shipped nationally that are designated for pet consumption. And these have been linked to cases. The concern is that if we have exposure to people in the household from these pets, it may be a different kind of exposure than what we've seen before, or in individuals who are immunocompromised from perhaps like cancer therapy or other reasons that could mean that we see either different kinds of mutations in the virus or a different clinical manifestation of disease. So it's not just for animal health, which I care a lot about, but it's also for human health that I'm worried about this.
And also, we still have a very large outbreak in cattle.
Yes, it's continuing, although I think California, which is the leading dairy state and the sort of epicenter of what we're seeing currently, is starting to get a handle on it. So we've seen a decrease in the new herds identified, even though if you go on weekly, you'll still see increases in the herd count of dairy cows. We're at over 300 herds to date nationally.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that those two serious influenza infections, the one in British Columbia and the one in Louisiana, they are H5N1 viruses, but they're a slightly different form of the virus than is infecting dairy cows. So again, it just brings up this concern about H5N1. It's a very dynamic virus. There's lots of versions of it out there circulating in lots of different animals and birds. And, it's just continuing to pose a greater and greater threat in terms of that spillover and leading to a pandemic.
So we have not yet seen person-to-person transmission. Is that something we're concerned about?
Absolutely. And again, even these mutations that have been detected in the infected people, those alone probably won't allow the virus to transmit. But we have no evidence of transmission yet. But it's really the highest form of human surveillance that we really need to do right now. Although that combined with, I do feel like we need to do more surveillance in broader populations that are at risk because, right now we know that the virus can cause mild disease in certain situations, but that means that we probably need to test more expensively to really figure out how much of that mild disease is being caused in these spillovers into humans.
Yeah, Andy, I couldn't agree more. I think that if we start to see sustained human-to-human transmission, that is a huge red flag and cause for concern beyond our sort of normal threat level high already for public health professionals. I think that means that the public would start to need to be a little bit more concerned outside of these high-risk groups. But it's also important to mention that we have seen sustained animal-to-animal transmission, and not just in birds where we expect it, but also in mammals, and not just the dairy cows where we expect it. Certainly possible. There have been studies that have shown ferrets can transmit to other ferrets, and this is another species that is particularly susceptible to influenza viruses. So this just gives the virus more opportunities to maybe fine-tune if there is a mutation to select for strains that could be more adapted to mammalian transmission.
What should have we been doing so far, Andy, to keep us from getting to where we are? And what can we do going forward to keep us from a scary pandemic situation?
Some of the responses that agencies are doing are right on target. I think we're probably not doing it as quickly as we should be, and we may not be doing it as extensively as we should be. But that's not necessarily a hard criticism of the response because there are a lot of both state and federal rules that have to be followed when you're surveying for a disease that's not viewed as an imminent public threat. When COVID first emerged and an emergency situation was announced, everybody was testing, everybody was running their own tests. You could ask people to take tests because it was an emergency situation. Right now, we're not in that emergency situation, so we're relying on state rules, state regulators, in certain situations, federal regulators, to do testing within their lanes. And that sometimes limits us in terms of how many people we can test and how many animals we can test and how quickly we can get those results.
Should we be doing more?
Well, certainly on animal surveillance, we should be doing more. We are starting to do more. So for dairy cows, there's a way to test kind of en masse using bulk milk tank tests. This means that you're taking the pooled milk from hundreds, thousands of cows and checking that. And if you get a positive, you can go back to the original farm to identify which farms may be positive. This is absolutely essential for control efforts for dairy cow to dairy cow spread, whether it's through direct cow movement, through personnel, through equipment, or through some other mechanism. I think we're certainly starting to suspect that because we see a lot of farms in proximity to each other getting it, that there could be roles for other animals in the transmission. And while this makes sense for wild birds, I think where we need to do more surveillance are in things like field mice, which we identified in Colorado to be positive, and we identified through laboratory experiments to actually be infected, not just necessarily carrying the virus, for example, on their fur or just because they got exposed to it somehow. So really understanding that disease ecology is essential, and also taking a peek at other species would be very important. So we know that goats are susceptible, so small ruminants, goats and sheep, could be the next area where we try to increase our surveillance. And the more we know about where the virus is in animals, the more we're able to not only halt the spread within at least the species that we raise for food, but also know which people may be at greatest risk of exposure.
So we're not quite at the stage where this is a risk to everybody, right, Andy?
Correct. We know that the infected cases that we've documented really come from exposure or working on a dairy farm, working at a poultry facility, and exposure to these backyard flocks of birds or wild birds that are infected. Raw milk we think is a danger, although we haven't had a confirmed human case of H5N1 from raw milk. We've had plenty of examples of animals getting infected by it. So those are the areas that if you're in one of those areas, you should practice more caution, or in the case of raw milk, just don't do it.
I want to add that if you do keep backyard poultry, I think a lot of people picked up the habit during the COVID-19 pandemic as a really great way to engage themselves and their kids in activities, that there are resources available. The United States Department of Agriculture and many states that have land-grant universities with extension services have a lot of materials on what you can do to protect your birds and protect your own health when working with them. And this applies to your neighbors too, because I think we see backyard poultry more and more often, even in an urban landscape, not just a rural landscape. So take a look at those resources and make sure that you know what to do to help protect your birds.
I will admit that I hugged a chicken over the winter break. And so probably good advice would have been to either wear a mask or make sure I thoroughly wash my hands right away.
Well, it depends. The birds themselves, when they get sick, often get very sick. It's pretty obvious that they're infected. Now, there are lots of other things you can also get from poultry, so I always recommend using excellent hygiene when coming into contact with them. And certainly, there is the possibility for birds to be earlier in infection and not necessarily have quite as many symptoms. So a good kind of word of caution is just take a lot of care if you are having any encounters with livestock, any kind of poultry, dairy cows, etc. And also just know what's in the area. For example, right now in the mid-Atlantic, we're starting to see H5N1 heat up in the wild bird population. So we've seen it now get into some commercial poultry flocks. So I would say right now is when people should be on high alert, right? And potentially change what you do as a result of the fact that we know that it's in the area. This is going to keep coming and going. It's had more staying power than most avian influenza outbreaks since it's been following the migratory birds north and south and continuing over many, many years, which is quite unusual or at least atypical for what we'd previously seen, for decades with avian influenzas. So really recognizing that you can take a peek at what's happening in your area by going to the USDA website may help you make some of the decisions based on the current risk in your area.
Andy, as you look into your crystal ball, what are you looking for to decide when this is going to become a greater threat to humans?
Yeah, I think the critical thing is understanding whether the virus that's in dairy cows right now will pick up mutations that will help it to be more transmissible in mammals. Right now, we know that milking equipment is transmitting the virus from animal to animal. I'm also looking to see if that virus changes the way it transmits and maybe becomes a respiratory pathogen among dairy cows. That would be another sign that this virus is changing and posing more of a risk to the human population. And I guess the other thing that I'm thinking about right now is, it never hurts for us to really view these situations as test runs for how we would respond to a true pandemic should the time rush be in. So personally, my laboratory, for instance, we're brushing up on all of our testing procedures. We're figuring out ways to bring viruses into the lab safely and quickly. And we're training up people to work in our high containment rooms, our biosafety level 3 laboratories, because we've had a few people leave and we're not trained up as well as we are right now. And we just want to increase our preparedness to make sure that if the time comes, we'll be ready to respond as quickly as possible.
Well, Meghan, what do you see sort of in your crystal ball? What is the impact, I guess, on the whole dairy industry? It's a huge industry.
It's a huge industry. I think this is an existential crisis, honestly. Dairy producers often really produce very close to the margin, meaning they don't make as much money as you think they do, right? There's a lot of cost that goes into raising and keeping animals for many, many years, and we don't yet know what the hit is going to be in terms of long-term animal health for animals that were infected. We know they can survive and that, few of them go the way of poultry, which is a high mortality event in poultry. So it's much lower mortality, but many of them could have impacts to their productivity for years, perhaps the rest of the animal's life. In addition to that, the dairy industry has not needed to address this kind of biosecurity need in a very long time. Most of the barns, at least in warmer climates, are dry lot dairies, meaning that they've got a roof and no sides, which allows birds to come in, it allows cats to come in, it allows mice to come in, never mind that there are other things that can come in that could potentially be an issue here. And so really reimagining engineering of these farms could take a very long time. It's quite expensive to put in these barns. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the dairy industry and having to grapple with this. I think also really that thinking about these industries as interconnected from a disease perspective is something a little bit newer to dairy. I think the poultry and swine industries, because of influenzas, have had to do it a little bit more in the past. And so now there's kind of this new big industry player at the table. And the structure of the dairy industry is much different than the structure of the poultry and swine industries, which are vertically integrated, meaning there are a couple companies with top-level decision makers, and then the decisions can filter down to the contract growers. In contrast, you have 25,000 farms and 25,000 or more decision makers among the dairy production industry. So I think it's a little bit more challenging because there are so many different ways and styles of raising dairy cows that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So lots of sympathy to the dairy industry, and I think that that's kind of our big thing looking forward from an animal health perspective.
Meghan Davis, Andy Pekosz, thanks so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.